After World War II, everything changes. So here we have that second wave that dominates immigration to the United States. Not saying that Europeans no longer migrate to the United States. You definitely see, though, an overwhelming decline in terms of number of Europeans and an increase in the number of Latin Americans and Asians. And so just by going through our choropleth map from 1950 to 1970 to 1990 to 2000, you can see more red and orange on the map, replacing a lot of that blue and purple. So what we got going on there is to change the new wave. So let's go ahead and we'll go back and look at Mexico first. Mexican migration to the United States. If we go back way back to 1880, we can see that the migration has historically been there along the southwestern border. So that's something that doesn't really, just kind of continues on and on and on. And so we see that trend continue. The only exception to where you would see migrants from Mexico in the United States beyond the southern border would have been Chicago. Chicago historically has been a large destination for a lot of Mexican immigrants, and you can see that definitely in the local culture today up there. Up there in Chicago, definitely in terms of food, but definitely in terms of its overall demographics still to this day. But when we go forward, when we look at Mexican migration to the United States, we can see it's changing beyond just those border states or Chicago. It starts increasing more in the rural part of the United States, pretty much there anywhere in the southern part of the United States, all the way stretching all the way up into Washington. And so there we see a large migration following jobs. And so what's going on there is a lot of agricultural, especially jobs, available in those particular areas, along with a variety of other service-related jobs. Helps to explain why you see a large migration of Mexicans in a variety of areas, quite dispersed. We definitely see the core areas, those core areas being the southern border states, especially California and Los Angeles and Southern California, along with Chicago. But now you're seeing increasing numbers there in what we traditionally think of as the American South. See North Carolina, see Atlanta, Georgia. And so what's going on there is a large boom in construction. Those are high growth areas right now. So what there is a shortage of labor. So filling in that shortage of labor combined with some agricultural jobs in those areas helps to explain why we see a large Mexican population in those particular areas. Of course, we're going to see a large number there in Mexico as well because it has a large Latin American influence beyond just Mexicans. Of course, a variety of Latin Americans, so we definitely see that. But also there in Chicago. And of course, chain migration is often at use here. And one example of this is in the case of Charlotte, North Carolina, which has seen a boom in the last 10 to 15 years. It has a major bank there. It's got NASCAR there. It's got these thriving industries. It's got manufacturing, a little bit of agriculture, and so subsequently it's growing. So what's being filled, a lot of the shortage of labor is in migration of Mexicans, in particularly from a city called Matamoros, which is on the southern border with Texas. And so Matamoros is a migration stream as far as an origin of a migration stream where the destination is there in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Mecklenburg County. And so this is one example of a chain migration that started with one and a few individuals from Matamoros that over time more of a stream develops and a chain develops because of the advancements in transportation and communication. And that's going to be key to understanding much of the second wave is the fact that you're going to get more migrants, but also migrants coming from a farther distance. Obviously, Mexican's not a great example because the border right there, but in terms of Asians and a lot of other Latin Americans, especially a little farther south of Mexico, the opportunity that they can come to the United States is facilitated by airplane transportation overwhelmingly, which that's where many of the migrants to the United States actually come, not walking across the border, but actually by flying in to the United States. So we'll go ahead and look at different groups, and so we'll start off with looking at the Cubans. So the Cubans, when they really start to come there was the 1960s to the United States, and the Cubans overwhelmingly there in southern Florida. And that makes sense. About 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida is the island and country of Cuba. And so what we have is the Cuban Revolution, and you see a large migration of we can think of these as refugees, and with the United States being sympathetic because we don't like, well, at the time we didn't like the Cuban regime, the Cuban leadership, so we're accepting of all of those that would want to flee that leadership to come to the free land that is the United States. And so we can see that especially there in the southern tip of Florida, in Miami, overwhelmingly. Other examples, next up we have the Dominicans from Dominican Republic, and there, especially there in the 80s, but then throughout the 90s and 2000s, you see a large outmigration of Dominicans to, in particular, New York City. So New York City is where you see a large Dominican population. You can see that heavily in certain neighborhoods, certain boroughs of New York City. You see a large Dominican population, which in some areas predominantly Spanish-speaking because of that. Another particular group, the El Salvadorans, they're a little bit more dispersed. So what's going on in El Salvador? A lot of violence. In fact, it's one of the most violent places in the Western Hemisphere. So it's a place where a lot of outmigration. There you see a large outmigration to other areas, and so beyond New York City and the southern tip of Florida, but also Washington, D.C., Houston, but overwhelmingly Los Angeles is where you see a large number of El Salvadorans. And so the moral to the story here is we have Latin Americans who have started to migrate to certain areas. Yeah, the Mexicans have migrated to all throughout much of the United States, but you see Dominicans migrating to certain areas, El Salvadorans migrating to certain areas, and in other Latin American groups you're going to see the same thing in terms of chain migration playing a key role. The first Asian group I'm going to refer to are the Filipinos, who have come to the United States throughout much of the 20th century. So like most of the other Asian American groups, this group has come throughout the 20th century, where most of the other ones I'm going to be talking about have come later. But we still see a steady migration. A lot of this is due to the fact that Philippines was one of the few examples of a colony of the United States. And so it's something we inherited from the Spanish-American War. We inherited the Philippines. So it's not something we essentially sought after, but it's something we inherited as being victorious in the Spanish-American War. So subsequently, we've had a lot of Filipino migration throughout the 20th century, and in a few different waves that are more specific to that migration. But the moral of the story here is a lot of these have been essentially brides or wives of military personnel. So you see this over time, but nonetheless, the Filipinos you see in large numbers there along the western coast or in New York City and Chicago. And so one of the themes you'll see throughout much of the Asians is the fact they typically cluster in large urban areas. Exceptions being often places in more rural areas, for example, college towns for research or for university training, i.e. education. And so that's the case of the Filipinos. The other key group we could say is from the 1970s, where you really start to see a large number of them, are the Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese, if we go back to 1980, we can see the 1970s is where a large number of Vietnamese, and this has to do with the Vietnam War. And so once again, something from a war explains why we see a large Asian group. In this case, the Cold War, so the Vietnamese that were essentially refugees who did not want to be underneath communist-led Vietnam, essentially fled to the United States, where we gave them refuge, thus they are refugees. And you see a large number of Vietnamese that have over time clustered throughout much of the United States, but they're especially along the western coast. And so what happens is you see a chain migration in which one person migrates to a particular area, in the case of Vietnamese, probably somewhere along the west coast. And then as over time, maybe a generation or two, another group might migrate further into the interior, maybe to a college town, maybe to Denver, maybe to Houston. So you can see how over time, urban areas become more and more populated by a particular group as chain migration, as you have that initial person migrating to an area, stimulating a new migration to a new location. So that then thus is going to create a new stream. Another group we're going to look at are the Koreans. The Koreans you really don't see till 1980s in large numbers, and so once again, Korea, boy, what does that have to do with anything? A war, once again. So South Korean, North Korean, of course, that whole conflict there. So we've been more sympathetic to Koreans over time. Especially in the 1980s, you see a larger number of Koreans moving to the United States. And so the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Koreans, all related interwar as those first main waves of migrants from Asia. The second big waves are going to be from either China or India. So the Chinese, we don't really see in large numbers until more recently, till the 1990s, but that's today the largest migration of Asians are Chinese. The second highest group would be those from India. So the thing about the Chinese and the Indians is typically those that are migrating, not always, but typically, especially the Indians, are going to be higher education levels. So they're going to already be equipped with more education skills, more skills that are suited for high-tech jobs, and so subsequently they become more increasingly in demand. So there, oftentimes we see a brain gain, but oftentimes more recently we're seeing a return migration of Indians back to India, and so that can be seen as a brain drain for the United States and subsequently a brain gain for India. And so what we see here is, once again, a lot of chain migration at work for all these different groups. Further, you see them clustering typically in neighborhoods or in areas that are similar to them. You see large examples of Chinatowns in, for example, San Francisco, Chicago, New York City, also Los Angeles. And so you see these ethnic neighborhoods, these ethnic enclaves develop, but all of this makes sense. So we see these very similar patterns of these mass migrations, these large group migrations, in which they're utilizing overwhelmingly chain migration.